A widower rancher rode out to pay a black widow her wages, but found her feeding orphan kittens. The weathered cowboy dismounts his horse, crumpled payment in hand, watching the solitary woman cradle tiny mewling lives against the dying light. The town sees him as a broken shadow. Whispers follow about the grieving father, who can't even care for his own sick child. They expect him to fail, to lose everything that matters. But this mysterious woman by the creek, feared and shunned by all, possesses something he desperately needs: the power to heal what's dying. Yet their growing bond threatens to expose buried secrets that could destroy them both, truths someone will kill to keep hidden. Will they risk everything to save what they love most? Or will the forces hunting them tear apart their fragile hope forever? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The fever had taken hold of Tommy 3 days ago. Jed Harper pressed his calloused palm against his son's burning forehead and felt his heart crack a little more. The baby's breathing came in short, desperate gasps that echoed through the empty ranch house like whispered prayers. Doc Henderson had been blunt. The child needed constant care, more than a working rancher could provide alone. Jed stared out the window at his failing cattle ranch. 2 years since Sarah died, bringing Tommy into this world. 2 years of trying to be both father and provider while watching everything crumble around him. The pastures needed mending, the barn roof leaked, the cattle wandered too close to Miller's Creek because he couldn't ride the fences every day. Not when Tommy needed him. But Tommy needed more than he could give. The townspeople had opinions, of course. They always did. Mrs. Patterson from the general store had cornered him after church last Sunday. Her voice dripped with false sympathy as she suggested he send the boy to his sister in St. Louis. For the child's own good, naturally. Others whispered about finding him a wife. Quick arrangements happened all the time on the frontier. Practical marriages for practical people. The thought made Jed's stomach turn. He lifted Tommy from the makeshift crib. The baby's tiny body burned like a coal against his chest. This wasn't about convenience or social expectations. This was about his son's life. Mason Rourke appeared in the doorway without knocking. The ranch hand's broad frame blocked most of the morning light. His eyes held their usual mix of resentment and alcohol. "Cattle got loose again," Mason said. "Found them near the creek." Jed nodded. He'd have to ride out and check the fences. Again. Course, if you weren't distracted by other things, might notice these problems sooner. The comment hung in the air like smoke. Jed knew what Mason meant. Last winter, when 3 of his men came down with lung fever, Jed had hired Etta Smith to cook and tend them. Mason had made his feelings clear about bringing that woman onto the ranch. But Etta had saved those men's lives. Mason shifted his weight. "Heard you still owe her payment for that work." "I do. Could send one of the boys with it. Save you the trip." Jed studied his ranch hand's face. Mason's jaw was set tight, his knuckles white where they gripped his hat. The man's discomfort was obvious, but Jed didn't care about Mason's feelings. He cared about respect. "I'll handle it myself." Mason's expression darkened. He turned and walked away without another word. Jed laid Tommy back in his crib and grabbed his coat. The baby's fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't gotten worse either. Maybe an hour's ride wouldn't hurt. The payment sat folded in his vest pocket. 3 months' wages for work that had meant the difference between life and death for his men. Etta Smith had asked for nothing extra. No gratitude, no recognition. Just fair payment for fair work. Unlike most folks in Prairie Valley, she understood the value of keeping things simple. The ride to Miller's Creek took him through the heart of his struggling ranch. Broken fence posts stood like crooked teeth along the property line. Weeds choked the water troughs. Everything needed attention he couldn't give while caring for a sick child. Etta's cabin sat in a grove of cottonwood trees near the creek bend. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line. Her garden showed the first green shoots of spring vegetables, neat rows that spoke of careful planning. As Jed approached, he heard something unexpected. Singing. The voice was soft, melodic, carrying a tune he didn't recognize. He dismounted quietly and followed the sound around the side of the cabin. Etta Smith sat on a wooden crate in her back garden. Sunlight filtered through the cottonwood leaves and painted golden patches across her dark skin. In her lap, she held something small and moving. Jed stepped closer. Kittens. 3 tiny orange kittens no bigger than his fist. Etta held a makeshift bottle, feeding milk to the smallest one while the other 2 mewed softly in a basket at her feet. Her hands moved with practiced gentleness. She supported the kitten's head, angled the bottle just right, murmured encouragement as it drank. When the first kitten finished, she lifted the second one with the same careful attention. This was not the cold, mysterious woman the townspeople whispered about. This was someone who understood how to nurture fragile life. Etta looked up and saw him standing there. Most people would have been embarrassed, caught in a moment of tenderness. She simply nodded. "Mr. Harper." "Miss Smith, I brought your payment." She set the kitten back in the basket and stood. Her movements were economical, efficient, no wasted motion. "Coffee's hot if you want some." It wasn't really a question, more like a statement of fact. Coffee existed. He could have some if he chose. Jed found himself nodding. Inside her cabin, everything was clean and organized. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. Books lined one shelf, more books than most people in Prairie Valley owned. A kettle hummed on the wood stove. Etta poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on her small table. She didn't speak, didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. Just waited. Jed pulled the payment from his pocket and placed it beside his cup. Etta glanced at it but didn't count it. "Those men recovered completely," Jed said. "Good. Doc Henderson said they shouldn't have. Said the lung fever should have taken at least one of them." Etta sipped her coffee. "Sometimes people surprise you. Sometimes they do." Outside, one of the kittens began crying. Etta rose immediately, but Jed was already standing. "I should let you get back to them." She walked him to the door. The crying kitten had quieted, but she glanced toward the basket anyway. "Mr. Harper." He turned back. "Next time, bring the boy. Children need to see kindness in the world." Tommy's fever spiked that night. Jed paced the kitchen floor, bouncing his son against his shoulder while the baby's cries echoed off the walls. The sound cut through him like broken glass. Doc Henderson arrived before dawn, his medical bag heavy in his weathered hands. He examined Tommy by lamplight, pressing his stethoscope against the tiny chest and frowning at what he heard. "Lungs are congested. Fever's too high." The old doctor packed his instruments slowly. "This child needs constant attention, Jed. More than you can give while running a ranch." Jed felt the words like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" "Send him to your sister in St. Louis, or find yourself a wife, fast." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Doc Henderson had delivered babies in Prairie Valley for 30 years. He'd seen plenty of men faced with impossible choices. "How long do I have? Fever like this?" Doc shook his head. "Days, maybe a week if you're lucky." After the doctor left, Jed sat in his kitchen holding his son. Tommy's breathing was shallow, labored. Each tiny breath might be his last. The ranch could fail. The cattle could scatter to Mexico for all he cared. But losing Tommy would destroy him completely. Marriage to a stranger felt like betraying Sarah's memory. Sending Tommy away felt like admitting defeat. Neither option offered real hope, but Etta's words echoed in his mind. Children need to see kindness in the world. The sun was barely up when Jed saddled his horse. Tommy was wrapped in blankets, secured against his father's chest in a makeshift carrier Sarah had sewn before she died. The baby's fever had broken momentarily, giving him enough strength for the ride. Mason Rourke intercepted them at the barn. "Where you taking that sick child?" "Out. Doc said the boy needed rest, not bouncing around on horseback." Jed swung into the saddle. "Doc said a lot of things." Mason's face darkened. You're making a mistake, Jed. People talk. They see you riding out to that woman's place every few days. They start wondering. Let them wonder. Some wondering's dangerous, especially for folks who don't belong here in the first place. The threat was clear enough. Jed nudged his horse forward, leaving Mason standing in the barn doorway. The ride to Miller's Creek felt longer with Tommy strapped to his chest. Every few minutes, Jed pressed his palm against his son's forehead, checking for changes in the fever. The baby's breathing stayed steady but weak. Etta was in her garden when they arrived. She looked up from her vegetable patch and saw Tommy immediately. Her expression shifted from polite greeting to focused concern. The fever came back, Jed said. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached carefully. May I? Jed nodded. Etta placed her palm against Tommy's forehead with the same gentle touch she'd used on the kittens. Her fingers were cool and sure. How long? 3 days. Doc says he needs constant care. Etta studied the baby's face. Tommy's eyes were glassy with fever, but he wasn't crying. Something about Etta's presence seemed to calm him. Doc's right. Jed felt his last hope crumbling. If even Etta agreed Tommy needed more than he could provide, then maybe sending him away really was the only option. I was thinking, Jed began, then stopped. The request sounded impossible even in his own mind. What were you thinking? You saved my ranch hands last winter, brought them back from death's door when Doc said they were finished. Etta waited. She didn't prompt him or fill the silence with empty encouragement. I can't stop working the ranch. Tommy can't come with me every day. But he can't stay alone either. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You want me to watch him. During the day, while I handle the cattle and fencing, I'd pay you fair wages, Mr. Harper. I know it's not proper. I know people would talk. But you're the only person I trust with his life. Etta looked down at Tommy. The baby had fallen asleep against Jed's chest, his breathing slightly easier in the morning air. People will do more than talk. I know. Could cost you business, friends, standing in the community. I know. She reached out and touched Tommy's tiny hand. His fingers curled around hers instinctively, even in sleep. I lost a baby once, she said quietly. Same week I lost my husband. Fever took them both within days of each other. Jed hadn't known. The town gossips had plenty to say about Etta Smith, but they'd never mentioned a child. I'm sorry. I know about fevers. Know about babies who fight to stay in this world. She looked up at Jed. Know about fathers who'd do anything to save them. Hope flickered in his chest like a candle flame. My grandmother was a midwife back in Georgia, taught me about healing before I could properly read, herbs for fever, teas for congestion, ways to help tiny bodies fight what's trying to kill them. She paused, considering. I'll need to gather some plants from the creek bed, make a tincture for his lungs, feed him goat's milk mixed with honey until his stomach settles. You'll do it? Bring him at sunrise, pick him up at sunset, every day until the fever breaks completely. Jed felt tears threatening for the first time since Sarah's funeral. Thank you. Etta was already moving toward her cabin. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when he's well. Tommy stirred in his carrier, opening his eyes and looking around with more awareness than he'd shown in days, as if he understood that something important had just changed, as if he knew he was going to live. 3 months later, Tommy took his first steps across Etta's kitchen floor. His chubby legs wobbled as he reached for her outstretched hands, babbling sounds that almost resembled words. When he finally made it across the room, he clapped his hands and looked around for approval. Mama Et, he squealed, the closest he could come to saying her name. Etta scooped him up and spun him once, her face bright with pride. Through the window, she saw Jed riding up the path for his evening pickup. These moments had become the rhythm of their days. Sunrise brought a working father and his son. Sunset brought them back together. But something had changed in those 3 months, something neither of them had planned for. Jed entered without knocking now. The formal distance between them had dissolved into easy familiarity. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and rolled up his sleeves to wash his hands in Etta's basin. "He walked today," Etta announced. Jed's face transformed. The worry lines that had carved themselves around his eyes softened into genuine joy. "Show me." Tommy performed his wobbly walk again, this time from Etta to his father. Jed caught him in strong arms and lifted him high, earning delighted giggles. "My boy," Jed whispered. "My strong, healthy boy." Over Tommy's head, his eyes met Etta's. The gratitude there was deeper than words could express. She had saved his son's life. But more than that, she had given Tommy something Jed never could have managed alone. Patience, gentle guidance, the steady presence of someone who understood how to nurture growing things. "Stay for supper," Etta said. "Made enough stew for 3. These invitations had become routine. Jed would delay his departure, helping with small repairs around the cabin while Tommy played at their feet. They would share meals and quiet conversations about everything and nothing. The loneliness that had consumed both their lives was slowly being replaced by something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to family. Tonight was different, though. As they sat around Etta's small table, Tommy babbling happily in his high chair, Jed found himself studying her face in the lamplight, the way she anticipated Tommy's needs before he voiced them. How she could make him laugh with funny faces when he grew fussy. The gentle authority in her voice when she corrected his attempts to throw food. She would have been a wonderful mother to her own child. "Etta," he began, then stopped himself. She looked up from cutting Tommy's meat into tiny pieces. "What is it?" The words he wanted to say felt too large for the moment, too complicated for a simple supper conversation. Instead, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Thank you for all of this." Her fingers were warm beneath his palm. She didn't pull away immediately, and in that hesitation, he felt something pass between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. Tommy chose that moment to fling a spoonful of stew across the table, breaking the spell. Etta laughed and reached for a cloth to clean up the mess, her hand slipping away from Jed's. "He's getting independent," she said. "Wonder where he learned that." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Jed was saddling his horse when Mrs. Agnes Dolan's buggy rolled up the drive. The town matriarch climbed down with the careful dignity of her 70 years, but her expression was troubled. "Jed, we need to talk." He secured Tommy in his carrier and helped Mrs. Dolan into the kitchen. She accepted coffee but barely touched it, her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap. "People are talking. People always talk. Not like this. You spend every evening at that woman's place. Bring your child there daily. Folks are starting to wonder about the nature of your arrangement." Jed felt his jaw tighten. "The nature of my arrangement is that she cares for my son while I work. Nothing more complicated than that." Mrs. Dolan's pale eyes studied his face. "Isn't it?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Because the truth was, it had become more complicated. Much more. She saved Tommy's life. I know that. You know that. But the people whispering in the general store and after church services don't see a woman who saved a child. They see a colored woman spending entirely too much time with a white widower. Their opinions don't concern me. They should. Tom Bradley's talking about taking his cattle business elsewhere. Says he won't deal with a rancher who doesn't know his place. The threat was clear. In a community where reputation meant everything, social disapproval could destroy a man's livelihood faster than drought or disease. "And there's more," Mrs. Dolan continued. "Mason Rourke's been spreading stories around town. Claims you've lost your judgment. Says grief has made you do foolish things." Jed's hands clenched into fists. Mason had been trouble since the day he'd been fired from the ranch. But apparently, his resentment ran deeper than Jed had realized. What kind of stories? The kind that paint Miss Smith as something she's not. A temptress who's bewitched a grieving widower. Mason's got away with words when he's drinking, and men listen to him. Tommy began fussing in his carrier, sensing the tension in the room. Jed lifted him out and held him close, feeling the solid weight of his healthy son. "What would you have me do? Send Tommy away? Find some stranger to marry for the sake of appearances?" Mrs. Dolan's expression softened slightly. "I'm not saying it's right, Jed. I'm saying it's reality. This community has its ways, and folks don't take kindly to those who challenge them. Even when challenging them saved a child's life? Especially then. Kindness from the wrong sort of person makes some folks uncomfortable, forces them to question things they'd rather leave unexamined." Jed looked down at Tommy, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. 3 months ago, his son had been dying. Now he was healthy, happy, and thriving under Etta's care. "I won't abandon her, not after what she's done for us." Mrs. Dolan nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this answer. "Then you'd better prepare yourself for what's coming, because Mason Rourke isn't finished talking. And not everyone in this town is as understanding as they should be." The spring storms arrived with unusual fury that year. For 3 days, rain hammered Prairie Valley while lightning split the sky like angry scars. Miller's Creek swelled beyond its banks, turning Etta's peaceful garden into a muddy lake. Jed rode through the downpour on the storm's final morning, Tommy bundled tight against the weather. What he found at Etta's cabin made his heart sink. Water had risen halfway up her front steps. The neat vegetable rows were submerged beneath brown floodwater. Her chicken coop had collapsed, sending the birds scattering to higher ground. Worse yet, a massive cottonwood had fallen across the cabin's back corner, punching a hole through the roof. Etta stood in her doorway holding a bucket, catching drips from the damaged ceiling. Her face was calm, but Jed could see the worry in her eyes. This wasn't just inconvenience. This was disaster. "Pack what you need," he said without dismounting. "You're coming to the ranch until this gets sorted." "Mr. Harper, I can't. You can't stay here. Roof's compromised, floors flooded. One more storm and the whole place might wash away." Etta looked around her damaged home. The books she treasured were stacked on her table, rescued from the flood. Her dried herbs hung uselessly in the damp air. Everything she'd built here was threatened. "People will talk. Let them." But even as Jed said the words, he knew the consequences would be severe. A white widower bringing a black woman to live in his house would ignite every gossip in the county. Still, he couldn't leave her here to face the damage alone. Etta gathered her essential belongings while Jed loaded them onto his horse. The kittens she'd rescued months ago, now grown into sleek cats, followed behind as they made their way to higher ground. The Harper ranch house felt different with Etta's presence in it. She moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, settling Tommy for his afternoon nap and preparing a simple lunch from Jed's meager pantry. Her domestic skills transformed the bachelor dwelling into something that felt like home again. But outside, storm clouds of a different kind were gathering. Mrs. Patterson from the general store arrived first, claiming she wanted to check on their welfare after the storm. Her sharp eyes took in every detail: Etta's coat hanging by the door, her sewing basket on the kitchen table. The domestic intimacy that spoke of more than a temporary arrangement. "How Christian of you to offer shelter," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice dripping false sweetness. "Though I'm sure it's just until other arrangements can be made." More visitors followed throughout the week. Neighbors who'd never bothered to call before suddenly found reasons to stop by. Each came with the same barely concealed curiosity, the same pointed questions about how long this situation might continue. Jed watched their reaction to seeing Etta move comfortably through his home, the way she anticipated Tommy's needs, how she'd quietly mended his torn shirts and organized his chaotic kitchen. To him, these were acts of kindness from someone who understood the rhythm of family life. To them, it looked like something else entirely. The breaking point came when Mason Rourke showed up drunk on a Saturday afternoon. He'd brought 2 other former ranch hands with him, men who'd followed Mason when Jed fired them for laziness and insubordination. "Came to see how the mighty have fallen," Mason announced, swaying slightly on the porch steps. Jed stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Inside, he could hear Etta singing softly to Tommy, trying to keep the child calm despite the tension. "You're not welcome here, Mason. Public road. Free country. Can visit old friends if I want." Mason's bloodshot eyes focused with malicious intent. "Though I'm wondering if we're still friends. Hard to tell when a man abandons his own kind. Get off my property. See, that's the problem right there. Used to be your property. Your rules. Your people." Mason gestured toward the house. "Now looks like someone else is making the decisions. Someone who don't belong." The other men shifted uncomfortably. Even drunk, they could sense the dangerous edge in Jed's voice. "Last warning, Mason. What you gonna do? Set your woman on me? Heard she's got all kinds of special skills. The kind men pay for." Jed's fist connected with Mason's jaw before the insult was fully out. The former ranch hand stumbled backward, blood trickling from his split lip. His companions grabbed his arms before he could retaliate. "This ain't over," Mason snarled as they dragged him away. "Whole county's gonna know what kind of man you really are." That evening, Mrs. Dolan returned with disturbing news. A petition was circulating through Prairie Valley, calling for Etta's removal from the county for the safety and moral welfare of the community. Mason had been busy spreading his poison, painting their arrangement in the worst possible light. "Half the town's already signed," Mrs. Dolan reported grimly, the other half scared to speak against it. Jed felt the walls closing in around them. Social pressure was one thing. Legal action backed by community outrage was something else entirely. "There's more," Mrs. Dolan continued. "Strange thing, though. Mason knows an awful lot about Miss Smith's past. More than a man should know about someone he claims to despise. Been asking questions about her late husband, the mine accident that killed him. Almost like he's looking for something specific." The observation struck Jed as odd. Mason had always been vocal about his prejudices, but his current campaign felt personal, driven by more than simple hatred. "What kind of questions?" "About the cave-in. Who was responsible? Whether there were any witnesses still alive." Mrs. Dolan's weathered face creased with concern. "Jed, I've been thinking. Mason was working the mines before he came to your ranch. What if there's more to this than we know?" Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Another storm was coming, and Jed had the sinking feeling it would be worse than anything they'd weathered so far. Mrs. Dolan arrived at dawn with a leather satchel clutched against her chest. Her face was pale, her usual composure shaken by whatever she'd discovered during the night. "We need to talk, all of us." Jed led her into the kitchen where Etta was feeding Tommy his breakfast. The baby clapped his hands when he saw the familiar visitor, but Mrs. Dolan's grim expression didn't soften. "I spent half the night in the county records office, pulled every document I could find about the Blackstone mine collapse." She opened her satchel and spread yellowed papers across the table. "The accident that killed your husband, Miss Smith. It wasn't an accident." Etta's hands stilled on Tommy's spoon. Her face went carefully blank, the way it did when she was protecting herself from painful memories. 7 men died in that cave-in," Mrs. Dolan continued, "including your husband Samuel. The official report blamed unstable rock formations and bad luck, but I found the safety inspector's preliminary notes, the ones that never made it into the final report." She pointed to a handwritten page covered in faded ink. "Inspector noted multiple violations, insufficient timber supports, dangerous gas levels, warning signs ignored for weeks." Jed leaned forward to study the documents. Who was the mine foreman responsible for safety? Mason Rourke. The name hit the kitchen like a thunderclap. Suddenly, Mason's obsessive hatred made terrible sense. His knowledge of Etta's past, his desperate need to drive her away from Prairie Valley. "He covered it up," Etta said quietly. "Blamed the miners for their own deaths. Said Samuel and the others ignored safety protocols." Mrs. Dolan nodded grimly. "The mining company paid him handsomely to keep quiet about the real cause. Saved them thousands in lawsuits and compensation to the families. But you knew the truth," Jed realized, looking at Etta. "You were the witness who could destroy his story." Etta lifted Tommy from his chair and held him close. The baby sensed her distress and patted her cheek with sticky fingers. Samuel came home every night talking about the dangerous conditions, begged Mason to reinforce the tunnel supports. Mason told him to mind his own business or find work elsewhere. "Why didn't you speak up after the accident?" The question came out harsher than Jed intended. Etta flinched as if he'd struck her. Who would have believed me? A black woman accusing a white foreman of murder in front of a white judge and white jury. Her voice was steady, but pain flickered in her eyes. Mason made sure everyone knew the miners died because they were careless, reckless, too ignorant to follow proper safety measures. Mrs. Dolan gathered the papers into neat stacks. "He's been watching you all these years, making sure you stayed quiet and invisible. But now you're visible again, connected to a prominent rancher. People might actually listen if you decided to tell the truth." "So he's trying to destroy her credibility first," Jed concluded. "Paint her as a temptress who corrupts good men. Make sure no one would believe her accusations if she ever found the courage to speak." Outside, horses approached at a gallop. Through the window, Jed saw Mason riding hard toward the house with 4 other men behind him. Their faces were set with grim purpose. "He knows we know," Mrs. Dolan whispered. Mason dismounted and strode toward the porch without waiting for his companions. His usual drunken swagger had been replaced by cold determination. "Time to end this charade, Jed. Send the woman out. We're taking her back where she belongs." Jed stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between Mason and the door. "She's under my protection." "Your protection don't mean much when the whole town's against you. Sheriff's got a warrant for her removal. Claims she's a public disturbance." "On whose complaint?" Mason's smile was ugly. "Mine, and about 50 other concerned citizens who signed the petition." Behind Jed, the door opened. Etta emerged carrying Tommy, her chin raised in quiet defiance. Mrs. Dolan followed, clutching her satchel of evidence. "You killed my husband," Etta said simply. The words cut through the morning air like blade strikes. Mason's face went white, then flushed red with fury. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Blackstone Mine." 7 dead men because you ignored safety warnings. You took money to cover up the truth and let their families think they died from carelessness. "Prove it." Mrs. Dolan stepped forward, opening her satchel. "I can. Original safety reports, inspector's notes, financial records showing payments to you from the mining company." Mason's eyes darted between the 3 adults, calculating odds and options. His companions shifted nervously, sensing the situation had moved beyond simple community outrage. "Those are lies, forgeries." "Then you won't mind if we take them to the territorial judge," Jed said. "Let him decide what's true and what isn't." For a moment, Mason's mask slipped completely. The fear underneath was naked and desperate. He'd built his entire life on the lie that had buried 7 good men. If that lie crumbled, everything else would fall with it. "You think anyone cares about a bunch of dead miners? About the word of some woman who spreads her legs for any man who will have her?" This time it was Mrs. Dolan who moved. The elderly woman stepped forward and slapped Mason across the face with surprising force. "That's enough. I've heard all I need to hear." Mason rubbed his cheek, his eyes burning with hatred. But when he looked around at his companions, he saw doubt creeping into their expressions. The ugly truth was harder to deny when it came with documented proof. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Etta said firmly. "It's been over for 3 years. I just finally found the courage to end it." Mason mounted his horse and rode away without another word. His companions followed, but their earlier enthusiasm had evaporated. Truth had a way of changing everything, even for those who preferred comfortable lies. Jed put his arm around Etta's shoulders as they watched the riders disappear. Tommy babbled happily in her arms, oblivious to the momentous shift that had just occurred. The real fight was just beginning. The territorial judge arrived in Prairie Valley on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after Mrs. Dolan first uncovered the truth about the Blackstone mine collapse. Judge William Harrison was a stern man with steel-gray hair and no patience for legal theatrics. He'd seen enough frontier justice to recognize the difference between mob rule and actual law. The courtroom overflowed with spectators. Half the county had turned out to witness Mason Rourke's trial for criminal negligence and conspiracy to cover up workplace deaths. Etta sat in the front row beside Jed, Tommy quiet in her lap. The baby had grown during the long months of legal proceedings, walking steadily now and speaking in short sentences that delighted everyone who heard him. Mason entered in shackles, his once swagger reduced to shuffling defeat. 6 months in the county jail awaiting trial had hollowed his cheeks and dimmed his arrogant fire. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Mrs. Dolan had uncovered not just the original safety reports, but financial records showing regular payments from the Blackstone Mining Company to keep Mason's mouth shut about the real cause of the collapse. More damaging still were the other witnesses who had finally found courage to speak. 3 surviving miners testified about Mason's refusal to address dangerous conditions in the weeks before the cave-in. The mine company's former bookkeeper produced records of the cover-up payments. Even the original safety inspector, now retired and living in Denver, had traveled to Prairie Valley to set the record straight. Etta took the witness stand on the trial's second day. Her voice was steady as she recounted Samuel's nightly warnings about tunnel instability, how he'd begged Mason to reinforce the supports, how Mason had threatened to fire anyone who complained about working conditions. "My husband died because this man valued profit over human life," she concluded. 7 families lost fathers and husbands because Mason Rourke chose money over safety. Mason's attorney, a nervous young man from the county seat, tried to discredit her testimony by questioning why she'd remained silent for so long. But Judge Harrison cut him off sharply. Witness had every reason to fear for her safety in bringing forward these accusations. The court finds her testimony credible and consistent with documented evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all charges. Judge Harrison sentenced Mason to 15 years hard labor and ordered him to pay restitution to the victims' families. The mining company faced additional civil penalties that would total more than $50,000. As the gavel fell, Etta felt 3 years of buried grief finally begin to ease. Samuel's death had meaning now. Justice had been served, not just for him, but for all the men who died in that preventable collapse. Outside the courthouse, the community's reaction was mixed but telling. Many who had signed the petition calling for Etta's removal now offered awkward apologies. Others avoided eye contact entirely, embarrassed by how quickly they'd believed Mason's lies about her character. Mrs. Patterson from the general store approached hesitantly as Etta and Jed loaded Tommy into their buggy. "Miss Smith, I owe you an apology. We all do. You showed more courage than the rest of us combined." Similar scenes played out across Prairie Valley in the weeks that followed. People who had shunned Etta during the darkest days now sought her friendship. Her skills as a healer, always valued in private, were suddenly requested openly. Mothers brought sick children to her door. Ranchers asked for her help with injured livestock. The transformation wasn't universal. Some holdouts still muttered about proper places and social boundaries. But they were outnumbered now by folks who had learned the difference between gossip and truth. 3 months after the trial, Jed found Etta in her rebuilt garden beside Miller's Creek. The flood damage had been repaired with help from half the county. Her vegetable rows were more extensive than before, and she'd added a small greenhouse for year-round growing. Tommy played at her feet, chasing the grown kittens she'd rescued all those months ago. The orange cats had multiplied, and now a whole pride of felines supervised the garden work from sunny spots between the tomato plants. "Etta." She looked up from the herbs she was harvesting, her face brightening at his voice. The formal distance between them had long since dissolved into something deeper and more intimate. "The house feels empty when you're not there." It was as close to a proposal as Jed could manage. Direct declarations of love felt too small for what they'd built together through crisis and conflict. Etta set down her basket and brushed the soil from her hands. "Tommy needs stability, a real family. We all do." She studied his face, seeing the man he'd become over the past year. The broken widower had been replaced by someone stronger and more confident, someone who had learned to fight for what mattered most. People will still talk. Let them. We've survived worse than gossip. Tommy chose that moment to toddle over and wrap his arms around both their legs, trapping them in an embrace that felt entirely natural. "Mama et marry Papa?" he asked with the straightforward logic of a child who saw love without complications. Etta laughed and lifted him up, spinning him once before settling him on her hip. "What do you think, little man? Should we make this official?" The wedding took place on a golden October afternoon in Mrs. Dolan's front parlor. The elderly woman had insisted on performing the ceremony herself, having been ordained as a minister in her younger years back east. Most of Prairie Valley attended, a turnout that would have been impossible before the trial revealed Mason's lies. Etta wore her mother's pearl necklace and a dress of deep blue silk that Mrs. Patterson had ordered specially from Kansas City. Jed stood beside her in his best suit, Tommy perched on his shoulders wearing a tiny bow tie that made the wedding guests smile. As they exchanged vows, one of the orange cats wandered into the parlor and settled at Etta's feet. The kitten she'd been feeding that first day had grown into a sleek tom with golden eyes and an independent spirit. His presence felt like a blessing from the small beginning that had grown into this moment of joy. Mrs. Dolan pronounced them husband and wife, just as the sun set over Miller's Creek. The community that had once threatened to tear them apart now celebrated the family they'd chosen to become. Later, as guests shared cake and stories on the front porch, Jed found himself remembering the day he'd ridden out simply to pay a woman her wages. He'd expected a brief transaction. Instead, he'd found the courage to trust someone the world told him to fear. That trust had saved his son's life, brought justice to 7 dead men, and created a love strong enough to transform an entire community. Tommy fell asleep in Etta's arms as the evening wound down, his small body completely relaxed against the woman he'd always known as mother. The three of them formed a complete circle now, bound not by blood or convention, but by the deeper ties of choice and commitment. Around them, friends and neighbors cleaned up the celebration and prepared to head home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and ordinary responsibilities, but tonight belonged to the quiet miracle of a family that had grown from the smallest act of kindness into something beautiful and unbreakable. The orange cats settled around their feet as the stars came out, purring in the gathering darkness like a benediction on all the broken things that had finally learned how to heal.